Karen never expected the solar lights to be more than just a nuisance. But when her late-night vandalism triggered the high-tech home security system, she found herself in a nightmare of her own making. As the automated fence began to close in, Karen's panicked cries for help fell on deaf ears, because no one was coming to save her this time. It was a cool autumn night when Karen made her move. The Thompsons' overpriced solar lights had been taunting her for months, their smug glow illuminating the dark streets of the affluent neighborhood. Now, under the cover of darkness, she crept through the shadows, a pair of bolt cutters gripped tightly in her hand. "Stupid eco-friendly bullshit," she muttered, snipping through the wires with practiced ease. One by one, the lights flickered and died, plunging the Thompsons' manicured lawn into darkness. Karen couldn't help but grin. Finally, a bit of justice in this world. As she turned to leave, a sudden beeping sound pierced the night. Karen froze, her heart pounding. She'd heard the rumors about the Thompsons' high-tech security system, but she'd never taken it seriously. Until now. "Oh crap," she whispered, panic rising in her chest. Spinning around, she saw the automated fence lining the perimeter of the property begin to slide open, metal bars glistening in the moonlight. Karen knew she needed to move fast. Clutching the bolt cutters, she sprinted toward the sidewalk, her sneakers pounding against the pavement. But as she reached the edge of the lawn, the fence began to close, steel bars sliding together with a sickening clang. "No, no, no," Karen screamed, desperately trying to squeeze through the narrowing gap. She could feel the cold metal biting into her skin as she fought to free herself, the bolt cutters clattering to the ground forgotten. Trapped. That was the only word that echoed through her mind as the fence continued to close, trapping her like a wild animal. Karen's pleas for help fell on deaf ears. The Thompsons were long asleep, blissfully unaware of the intruder in their yard. As the last of the bars slid into place, Karen felt a surge of pure terror. She was well and truly caught, the consequences of her actions crashing down around her. Sinking to her knees, she stared out into the darkness, her breath ragged and uneven. "What have I done?" she whispered, the weight of her mistake finally sinking in. The smart fence had outsmarted her, and now she was at its mercy. Karen had no choice but to wait, trapped and alone, as the night wore on. Her fate now rested in the hands of the very people she had tried to wrong. The first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, casting an eerie glow across the Thompsons' manicured lawn. Karen huddled against the steel bars of the fence, her body stiff and aching from the long, restless night. As the sun's rays peeped through the gaps, she squinted, her eyes burning from fatigue and unshed tears. "Come on, someone has to be up by now," she muttered, scanning the quiet street for any sign of movement. But the neighborhood remained eerily still, the only sound the distant chirping of birds. Karen's stomach churned with dread as the realization set in. No one was coming. The Thompsons were probably still asleep, blissfully unaware of the intruder trapped in their yard. She was on her own. "Okay, think," she whispered, racking her brain for a way out. But the more she struggled against the unyielding bars, the more the panic rose in her chest. She was caught, plain and simple, and the consequences were about to come crashing down. Just as Karen felt her last shred of hope slipping away, she heard the click of a deadbolt and the creak of a door opening. Whipping her head around, she watched as a middle-aged woman in a floral robe stepped outside, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. "Mrs. Thompson," Karen breathed, pressing her face against the bars. "Please, you have to help me." The woman's eyes widened in shock as she took in the scene. The broken solar lights, the trespasser trapped in her yard. For a moment, neither of them moved, the air thick with tension. Then, Mrs. Thompson's features hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Karen Wilkins," she said, her voice cold and measured. "I should have known." Karen's heart sank as she watched the woman turn and disappear back into the house, the door slamming shut behind her. Panic surged through her veins as she realized her only chance at freedom had just slipped away. "No, wait," she cried, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, I'm sorry. Let me out." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Karen was alone, trapped in a nightmare of her own making. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, she felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her. A crushing sense of dread settling in the pit of her stomach. What was going to happen to her now? The sound of a car door slamming shut shattered the eerie silence that had settled over the Thompsons' property. Karen's head snapped up, her heart pounding as she watched Mr. Thompson emerge from his sleek, black sedan, briefcase in hand. "Oh, God, please," she whispered, pressing herself against the bars of the fence. "Mr. Thompson, help me." But the man simply ignored her, striding purposefully towards the front door. Karen's desperate cries fell on deaf ears as he disappeared inside, leaving her trapped and alone once more. "No, no, no," Karen cried, her fingers clawing at the unyielding steel. She couldn't believe this was happening, that her childish act of vandalism had spiraled so far out of control. The weight of her mistake was crushing her, the consequences closing in like a vice around her chest. As the minutes ticked by, Karen's panic only grew. She could feel the sweat beading on her brow, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Where were the Thompsons? Why weren't they coming out to confront her, to demand an explanation? The suspense was agonizing, the uncertainty eating away at her last shreds of resolve. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the front door swung open once more. Karen's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto the figures of Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, their expressions unreadable. "Well, well, well," Mr. Thompson drawled, his tone laced with a dangerous edge. "If it isn't our dear neighbor, Karen." Karen swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. "Please, I didn't mean for this to happen," she stammered, hating the way her voice quivered with fear. Mrs. Thompson crossed her arms over her chest, her brow furrowing. "Didn't mean for what to happen, Karen? Destroying our property. Trespassing on our land." She shook her head slowly, a mirthless chuckle escaping her lips. "I find that rather hard to believe." Karen opened her mouth to respond, to beg for mercy, but the words caught in her throat. She was trapped, cornered by her own foolish actions, and the realization was like a sucker punch to the gut. Mr. Thompson took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "You know, Karen, we've had our suspicions about you for a while now. Always lurking around, never quite fitting in with the rest of us." He paused, his lips curling into a humorless smile. "But this is the last straw." Karen felt a chill run down her spine as she watched the Thompsons exchange a loaded glance. It was clear they had no intention of helping her, of showing her any mercy. She was at their mercy now, and the realization was utterly terrifying. As the Thompsons turned and disappeared back into the house, Karen's heart sank. She was alone, trapped in a nightmare of her own making, with no idea what horrors might be waiting for her next. The minutes ticked by in agonizing silence as Karen waited, her nerves frayed and her muscles aching from the strain. The Thompsons had retreated back into the house, leaving her trapped and alone, her fate hanging in the balance. Just as the anxiety began to consume her, the front door swung open once more. Karen's head snapped up, her heart pounding, as Mr. and Mrs. Thompson emerged, this time accompanied by a burly, uniformed figure. "Oh, God," she whispered, her blood turning to ice. She'd known this was coming, that the Thompsons wouldn't let her off the hook, but the sight of the police officer still sent a jolt of pure terror through her. "This is him, officer," Mr. Thompson said, his voice laced with a satisfying edge of triumph. "The one we caught vandalizing our property." The officer, a gruff-looking man with a thick mustache, turned his steely gaze on Karen. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Karen's mind raced, scrambling for a way out, but the bars of the fence seemed to close in around her. "Please, you don't understand," she pleaded, her voice desperate. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The officer's expression remained impassive as he produced a set of handcuffs, the metal glinting in the morning light. "That's for the station to decide," he said, his grip tightening around Karen's wrists as he yanked her forward. Karen let out a strangled cry as the fence began to retract, her heart pounding in her ears. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be real. Yet, as the officer marched her towards the waiting patrol car, the harsh reality of the situation began to sink in. She was going to jail. The Thompsons had won, and she was the one paying the price for her foolish mistake. Panic and shame coursed through her veins as she was shoved into the backseat, the metal cuffs biting into her skin. Through the tinted window, Karen watched as the Thompsons stood on their perfectly manicured lawn, their expressions a mix of satisfaction and scorn. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to make them understand the depth of her regret. But the words caught in her throat, swallowed by the crushing weight of her own guilt. As the patrol car pulled away, Karen felt her last vestiges of hope slipping through her fingers. She was trapped, both physically and emotionally, and the consequences of her actions were about to come crashing down around her. The journey to the police station stretched out before her, a dark and uncertain path that would change the course of her life forever. The fluorescent lights of the police station felt like a spotlight, glaring down on Karen as she sat in the cold, hard chair. Her hands trembled, the cuffs still biting into her wrists as she stared blankly at the officer across the desk. "Okay, Ms. Wilkins, let's go through this one more time," the officer said, his tone stern but not unkind. "You're telling me you didn't mean to trigger the Thompsons' security system?" Karen nodded, her throat tight. I just wanted to get rid of their stupid solar lights," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think anyone would notice." The officer let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head. "Well, you were wrong about that, weren't you?" He paused, studying her with a calculating gaze. "You do realize you're facing some serious charges here, right? Destruction of property, trespassing, evading arrest." Karen felt the color drain from her face as the gravity of the situation truly sank in. She'd known the consequences would be severe, but hearing the officer list them out was like a punch to the gut. Her careless actions had landed her in a world of trouble, and there was no easy way out. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," she stammered, the words spilling out in a desperate torrent. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, I swear. I was so angry, and I wasn't thinking straight, and now—" Her voice trailed off, a helpless sob escaping her lips. The officer regarded her with a mixture of sympathy and exasperation. "Look, I get it, kid. We've all done stupid things we regret. But this," he gestured around the station, a frown creasing his brow. "This is a whole other level." Karen hung her head, the weight of her mistake crushing her. She knew she deserved whatever punishment was coming her way, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. All she could think about was the look of triumph on the Thompsons' faces as they watched her get hauled away. "What's going to happen to me?" she asked, her voice small and trembling. The officer leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Well, that's up to the courts to decide," he said. "But I can tell you this much. It's not going to be pretty. You're looking at some serious time, Ms. Wilkins." Karen's stomach churned with dread, her mind racing with 1,000 worst-case scenarios. Prison, fines, a permanent criminal record. The possibilities were endless, and each one was more terrifying than the last. As the officer began to rattle off the list of charges again, Karen felt her world narrowing to a single devastating truth. Her life as she knew it was over. The consequences of her actions were about to come crashing down, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The dull thud of the cell door echoed through the dimly lit hallway, sending a chill down Karen's spine. As she sank down onto the hard, metal bench, she couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of dread. This was it, the culmination of her reckless actions. After hours of interrogation and booking, she now found herself trapped behind bars, her freedom stripped away. The realization was both terrifying and humiliating, a bitter pill to swallow. Karen hugged her knees to her chest, her gaze fixed on the floor. She couldn't bear to look at the other inmates, couldn't stand the thought of their judgmental stares. All she wanted was to disappear, to wake up from this nightmare and find that it had all been a terrible dream. But as the minutes ticked by, the harsh reality of her situation only grew more inescapable. She was here, in this cold, sterile cell, and there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. The Thompsons had won, and she was the one paying the price. A sudden commotion from down the hall jolted Karen from her thoughts. She lifted her head, her heart pounding, as the sound of raised voices and the clang of metal grew louder. Peering through the bars, she caught a glimpse of two officers struggling to subdue a belligerent inmate. Karen watched, transfixed, as the scene unfolded. The inmate, a burly man with a shaved head and a face covered in tattoos, was cursing and thrashing, his eyes wild with fury. The officers, their faces strained with effort, finally managed to wrestle him to the ground, cuffing his hands behind his back. As they hauled the man away, Karen felt a shiver of fear run down her spine. This was the reality she now found herself immersed in, a world of violence, aggression, and lawlessness. A world she had never imagined she'd be a part of. "Guess I better get used to it," she murmured, the words bitter on her tongue. The thought of spending any amount of time in this place, surrounded by hardened criminals, was enough to make her stomach churn. But she knew she had no one to blame but herself. Burying her face in her hands, Karen felt the sting of tears in her eyes. She had made a mistake, a colossal one, and now the consequences were crashing down around her. The Thompsons, the police, the judge, they were all going to have a say in her future, and she had no control over it. As the reality of her situation fully sank in, Karen felt a strange sense of resignation wash over her. Whatever happened next, she knew she deserved it. The only thing she could do now was try to weather the storm, to face the consequences of her actions with whatever dignity she had left. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was the only way forward. The courtroom was a cauldron of tension, every eye fixed on Karen as she took her seat beside her public defender. The weight of her mistake hung heavy in the air, a palpable presence that seemed to suffocate her with each passing moment. As the judge entered and the proceedings began, Karen felt her heart pounding in her ears. She'd spent countless sleepless nights going over this moment, imagining the worst-case scenarios, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer intensity of it all. Beside her, her public defender leaned in, his voice low and urgent. "Okay, Karen, here's how this is going to go down. The Thompsons are pushing for the maximum sentence, so we need to tread carefully here." Karen nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. "I understand," she stammered, her fingers trembling as she gripped the edge of the wooden bench. The prosecutor rose, her gaze hardening as she fixed Karen with a steely stare. "Your Honor, the state is seeking a sentence of 5 years in a state penitentiary for the defendant, Karen Wilkins. The crimes she has committed, destruction of private property, trespassing, and evading arrest, are not only egregious, but they pose a threat to the safety and security of our community." Karen felt the blood drain from her face as the prosecutor's words sank in. 5 years. The very thought of it made her stomach churn with dread. She had known the consequences would be severe, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. Her public defender rose, his expression a mask of calm professionalism. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the seriousness of the charges, we would argue that a 5-year sentence is excessive, given the circumstances of the case. Ms. Wilkins has no prior criminal record, and her actions, while misguided, were not motivated by malice or a desire to cause harm." The judge regarded them both with a heavy, contemplative gaze. "Be that as it may, The fact remains that Ms. Wilkins' actions did indeed cause significant harm to the Thompsons' property and disrupted the peace of their neighborhood. This is a serious offense and one that cannot be taken lightly. Karen felt the world tilt on its axis as the judge's words sank in. She had hoped, foolishly, that her public defender's arguments would carry some weight, that the judge would see the error of her ways and show her leniency. But now, as the gavel came down, she knew that her dreams of a lenient sentence were shattered. Karen Wilkins, I hereby sentence you to 3 years in a state penitentiary, with the possibility of parole after 2 years for the crimes you have committed. May this serve as a lesson to you, and to others who would consider similar acts of vandalism and trespassing. As the courtroom erupted in murmurs and the guards stepped forward to escort her away, Karen felt a wave of numbness wash over her. 3 years. It was a lifetime, a sentence that would alter the course of her life forever. And all because of one foolish, impulsive act. The weight of her mistake had finally caught up with her, and the consequences were more devastating than she could have ever imagined. The steady rhythm of the prison bus as it rumbled down the highway was the only sound that pierced the heavy silence that hung over Karen. She stared out the tinted window, watching the world pass by as her heart sank with the realization of what lay ahead. 3 years. The words echoed in her mind, a crushing weight that she couldn't escape. As the bus pulled through the gates of the penitentiary, Karen felt a shiver of pure terror run down her spine. This was it. The moment her life as she knew it came crashing down. The guards ushered her inside, their grip firm on her arm as they led her through the maze of concrete and steel. The sights and sounds were overwhelming. The clanking of metal, the shouts of the inmates, the stench of despair that permeated the air. Karen felt her stomach turn, her resolve crumbling with each step. As she was processed and searched, Karen couldn't help but feel a crushing sense of shame. This was her reality now. A number, a statistic, a cautionary tale of the consequences of her own foolish actions. The dreams she had once held, the future she had envisioned, all seemed to slip through her fingers like sand. When she was finally escorted to her cell, Karen felt a wave of hopelessness wash over her. The cramped, barren space was a far cry from the cozy apartment she had once called home, a constant reminder of the life she had lost. Sinking down onto the hard bunk, she buried her face in her hands, the weight of her tears stinging her eyes. How did it all go so wrong? She whispered, the anguish in her voice palpable. She had never imagined her life would come to this. Trapped behind bars, her freedom stolen, all because of a moment of petty vengeance. As the days stretched into weeks, Karen found herself struggling to adapt to the harsh realities of prison life. The constant threat of violence, the monotony of the routine, the overwhelming sense of isolation. It was a gauntlet she had never been prepared to run. Each day felt like a battle, a test of her resolve that threatened to break her. But through it all, a glimmer of hope remained. It was the knowledge that, one day, she would emerge from this darkness a changed person. The 3 years that stretched before her would be a chance to reflect, to learn, to grow. And when she finally stepped back into the world, she would be a better, wiser version of herself, a testament to the power of redemption. With that thought in mind, Karen straightened her shoulders, her gaze hardening with determination. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready to face it, head on. The consequences of her actions had been severe, but she would not allow them to define her. This was her chance to start anew, to forge a better future for herself. And as the heavy cell door clanged shut behind her, Karen knew that, one day, she would stand tall and face the Thompsons again, not as a vandal, but as a survivor, her path forever altered by the lessons she had learned.